6 months after the Centauri Accords, as historians were already calling the negotiations, the galaxy was transforming in ways that few had anticipated. The Interspecies Justice Compact had grown from a human-led initiative to a movement encompassing over 60 species, each contributing their own perspectives on fairness and legal procedure. Zara found herself at the center of this transformation, serving as the first director of case review for the newly established Galactic Justice Observatory. The position had been created specifically for her, recognizing both her expertise in interspecies law and her unique perspective as someone who had experienced the failures of the old system firsthand. The observatory operated from a massive space station constructed in the Vega system, deliberately positioned at the intersection of major trade routes to symbolize its accessibility to all species. The facility housed legal scholars, investigators, and advocates from dozens of worlds, working together to review cases where traditional justice systems had potentially failed. Case number 2847, Zara announced to her team during their weekly review session. Corvin Malthes, a hegemony engineer convicted of sabotage after his industrial safety warnings were ignored by corporate leadership, sentenced to neural reconditioning despite evidence, suggesting he was attempting to prevent the accident that ultimately occurred. The team gathered around the holographic display was as diverse as the cases they reviewed. Dr. Raven Blackhawk, a human psychologist specializing in rehabilitation rather than punishment. Advisor Zin Kalar, a former crystal form judge who had defected after witnessing too many politically motivated convictions. Engineer First Class Togwell, a Centauri technical specialist whose analysis had already overturned 3 wrongful convictions. Neural reconditioning is considered torture under the Compact guidelines, Dr. Blackhawk observed. Even if sabotage could be proven, which the evidence clearly contradicts, the punishment violates basic standards of proportionality. The hegemony government has been resistant to observatory intervention, Zin Kalar noted. They've agreed to participate in their compact but maintain that existing sentences should not be subject to retroactive review. Zara had dealt with similar resistance from multiple governments struggling to adapt to the new standards. The solution had been to make compliance attractive through the carrot and stick approach that had become humanity's trademark diplomatic strategy. Send the preliminary review to the Hegemony Justice Ministry, she decided. Include our standard notification that continued. Cooperation with observatory recommendations will be factored into trade partnership evaluations and technology sharing agreements. It was a polite way of saying that species who ignored observatory findings would find themselves increasingly isolated from the growing progressive alliance. The economic incentives had proven remarkably effective at encouraging legal reforms. The success of the observatory had exceeded even the most optimistic human projections. In just 6 months, they had reviewed over 3,000 cases, resulting in the release or sentence reduction for nearly 800 individuals. More importantly, the threat of observatory review was causing legal systems across the galaxy to improve their standards preemptively. There's been an interesting development, Morrison announced as he entered the review chamber. He had been promoted to admiral following the success of his rescue mission, but still insisted on personally delivering sensitive information. Intelligence sources indicate that the Aquarian government is preparing to formally adopt all compact standards into their domestic legal code. The announcement was stunning. The Aquarians had been among the most reluctant participants in the new system, agreeing to minimal cooperation only under pressure. Full adoption of compact standards would represent a complete transformation of their legal philosophy. What changed their minds? Zara asked. Economics, Morrison replied with a slight smile. Species that have fully embraced compact standards are seeing average trade volume increases of 30%, largely due to improved relationships with human allied worlds. The Aquarians can't afford to remain on the outside of that prosperity. It was a perfect example of how humans had revolutionized galactic politics. Rather than challenging existing power structures through military force or diplomatic pressure, they had created alternative structures that were simply more effective. Species joined the Progressive Alliance not because they were forced to, but because membership provided tangible benefits. Zara's personal transformation had been equally dramatic. The condemned prisoner who had faced death on Terminus 7 was now one of the most influential legal authorities in the galaxy. Her writings on evidence-based jurisprudence had become required reading in law schools across dozens of worlds. "There's something else," Morrison continued. "The hegemony has requested a formal meeting with you specifically. They want to discuss case review procedures for their entire legal backlog, potentially tens of thousands of cases. That would represent the largest systematic review in observatory history," Dr. Blackhawk observed. "We'd need to expand our staff by at least 300%. "Already approved," Morrison replied. "Director Williams has authorized recruitment from any species that meets compact certification standards. We're going to have the resources to tackle this properly." The expansion of the observatory reflected the broader transformation occurring throughout human space. Earth had become the de facto capital of the Progressive Alliance, its orbital facilities growing daily as new species sought partnership opportunities. The humans had achieved something that traditional galactic powers had considered impossible. They had made progressive values profitable. During her lunch break, Zara often visited the station's observation deck, where she could see the constant traffic of ships from across the galaxy. Beings who had once been enemies worked together on joint projects, their conflicts set aside in pursuit of common goals. It was the future that human diplomats had envisioned when they first challenged the galactic status quo. "Quite a view," said a familiar voice behind her. She turned to find Captain Morrison, though she still thought of him by his old rank despite his promotion. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is real," Zara admitted. "6 months ago I was facing death for a crime I didn't commit. Now I'm helping to reshape how justice works throughout the galaxy." "The humans have a saying," Morrison replied. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We just helped bend it a little faster. What happens next?" Zara asked. "The traditional powers are adapting, but slowly. There are still species that refuse to participate in the compact. Change takes time," Morrison said, "but the momentum is clearly on our side. Every species that joins makes it harder for the holdouts to resist. Eventually, universal justice standards won't be a revolutionary concept. They'll just be the way things are done." A chime from Zara's communicator indicated that the afternoon session was about to begin. Another dozen cases awaited review, each representing an individual whose life had been affected by the failures of traditional justice systems. The work was demanding, but it was also deeply satisfying. "Case number 2848, she announced as the team reassembled. "Dr. Yev Kess, a Zephyrian medical researcher convicted of unethical experimentation for developing treatments that contradicted official medical doctrine." As she began the review, Zara reflected on how her own case had become the catalyst for all of this. The universe had a sense of irony. The attempt to silence one voice of scientific reason had ultimately amplified the cause of justice throughout the galaxy. Outside the station's viewports, ships continued their endless dance of commerce and diplomacy, carrying beings and ideas between worlds that had once been strangers or enemies. It was a future worth the struggle to achieve, and worth the continued effort to protect. Centauri Station buzzed with tension as delegations from across the galaxy gathered for negotiations that would determine the future of interspecies justice. The station's neutral design couldn't hide the underlying currents of conflict. Traditional powers on one side, Progressive Alliance members on the other, with dozens of smaller species watching to see which way the tide would turn. The Aquarian delegation arrived with great fanfare, their ornate transport ship displaying the full regalia of an ancient civilization. High Magistrate Velcorin, the same official who had condemned Zara, led a team of experienced diplomats and legal scholars. Their strategy was immediately apparent: portray the humans as dangerous upstarts challenging the foundations of galactic order. The species Terra seeks to overturn legal traditions that have maintained peace and stability for over 2,000 years, Velcorin declared during the opening session. They would have us abandon proven systems of justice in favor of experimental philosophies that have never been tested at galactic scale, Director Williams responded, with the calm confidence that had made her legendary among human diplomatic circles. "We're not asking anyone to abandon their legal traditions. We're simply proposing that those traditions be held to certain minimum standards of evidence and proportionality. If a system can't meet those standards, perhaps it needs to be re-examined." The first phase of negotiations focused on the specific details of Zara's case. Human legal experts presented their analysis of the evidence, demonstrating conclusively that the contamination incident had been caused by mechanical failure rather than criminal negligence. The presentation was methodical and devastating, leaving little room for the Aquarian claims of intentional sabotage. Even accepting your technical analysis, countered Aquarian prosecutor Fel Thane, the defendant was responsible for the safety of her vessel and crew. Command responsibility demands accountability for all consequences of leadership decisions, regardless of intent or circumstance. It was Dr. Chen who delivered the response that shifted the entire debate. Command responsibility is indeed a valid principle, but it must be balanced against proportionality of punishment. Even if we accept maximum culpability for the accident, does contamination through negligence warrant death by acid dissolution? Would any reasonable being consider such punishment appropriate for any crime short of genocide? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Several neutral observers shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the truth behind the human argument. The death sentence imposed on Zara was so disproportionate that it revealed the political rather than judicial nature of her conviction. During the recess, Zara found herself approached by Ambassador Threxvol, a representative from the hegemony worlds who had been observing the proceedings with obvious interest. The insectoid being spoke in the clicking, translated language of his species. Your case has created significant discussion among the hegemony ruling castes, he said. Many of our own legal precedents rely on similar principles of absolute governmental authority. If your human allies succeed in establishing universal standards for evidence and proportionality, it could affect thousands of cases across our territories. Is that a threat or an opportunity? Zara asked. Both, Threxvol replied honestly. Change is always dangerous for established power structures, but stagnation is equally dangerous when it allows injustice to flourish unchecked. The second phase of negotiations expanded beyond Zara's individual case to address the broader implications of the Interspecies Justice Compact. The human delegation presented evidence of similar miscarriages of justice across dozens of species territories, building a comprehensive argument that the traditional system was fundamentally flawed. What you're proposing amounts to interference in sovereign internal affairs, objected the crystal form representative, whose species had a particular investment in maintaining existing power structures. No government can function if its legal decisions are subject to review by external bodies. No government should function if its legal decisions violate basic principles of justice, Morrison replied. He had been given a formal role in the negotiations despite his military background, a decision that reflected the human preference for practical experience over diplomatic credentials. The sovereignty argument has been used to justify atrocities throughout galactic history. At some point, the community of civilized species must draw lines that cannot be crossed. The debate that followed was fierce but illuminating. Traditional powers argued for stability and respect for established authority, while Progressive Alliance members demanded accountability and universal standards. The neutral observers found themselves increasingly swayed by the human arguments, particularly when presented with evidence of how the current system had failed citizens across multiple species. It was during the third day of negotiations that the breakthrough occurred. Ambassador Corvash of the Altarian Federation, one of the most respected neutral voices in galactic politics, stood to address the assembly. The humans have presented evidence that cannot be ignored, she said in her melodious voice. While their methods may be unconventional, their fundamental argument is sound. The case of Zara Veltan represents a failure of justice so severe that it demands systemic response. Her next words sent shockwaves through the traditional delegations. The Altarian Federation announces its intention to join the Interspecies Justice Compact. Pending final approval by our governing council, we believe that the principles outlined in this document represent the natural evolution of galactic law toward greater fairness and accountability. The announcement was followed by similar declarations from 6 other neutral species, creating a cascade effect that fundamentally altered the balance of power in the negotiations. The Progressive Alliance was no longer a fringe movement led by upstart humans. It was becoming a legitimate alternative to the traditional galactic order. High Magistrate Velcorin requested a private meeting with the human delegation, a clear sign that the Aquarian position was weakening. The meeting took place in one of the station's secured conference rooms, with only the primary negotiators present. "You have placed us in an impossible situation," Velkorin said without preamble. "If we acknowledge error in the Velton case, it undermines confidence in our entire legal system. If we maintain our position, we face increasing isolation from a growing alliance of progressive worlds." "There's a third option," Williams replied. "Acknowledge that the case was decided based on incomplete information, commute the sentence, and work with us to develop improved standards for future proceedings. Frame it as evolution rather than admission of error. And what guarantee do we have that this cooperation will end human interference in our internal affairs?" "None," Williams said bluntly. "But you'll have the guarantee that continued cooperation will bring access to human technology, trade partnerships, and mutual defense agreements. The alternative is watching your neighbors prosper while you maintain increasingly costly isolation." It was classic. Human diplomacy, the offer of partnership, coupled with the implied threat of consequences for refusal. But it was effective because the benefits of cooperation were real and substantial. The final session of negotiations was held in the station's main assembly chamber, with representatives from over 100 species in attendance. The agreements reached would reshape galactic civilization, but the immediate focus remained on the individual case that had started it all. The Aquarian government agrees to commute the death sentence imposed upon Zara Velton, Velkorin announced. "In recognition of new evidence regarding the circumstances of the contamination incident, and in the spirit of interspecies cooperation, the defendant will be released to the custody of the Terran diplomatic mission." The announcement was met with applause from Progressive Alliance members and stunned silence from traditional powers. But the real revolution was yet to come. "Furthermore," Velkorin continued, "the Aquarian government expresses its willingness to participate in the development of improved standards for interspecies legal cooperation, as outlined in the proposed Justice Compact." Zara felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the magnitude of what had been accomplished. Not only had her own death sentence been lifted, but the case had become the catalyst for systemic change that would protect countless others in the future. Williams stood to address the assembly one final time. "Today marks the beginning of a new era in galactic jurisprudence. The Interspecies Justice Compact represents our collective commitment to principles that transcend species boundaries. The presumption of innocence, the requirement for evidence-based proceedings, and the fundamental truth that justice delayed is justice denied. We invite all civilized species to join us in building a future where law serves truth, rather than convenience." Earth was unlike any world Zara had ever seen. While most galactic capitals were carefully planned cities that grew organically over millennia, humanity's homeworld was a chaotic mixture of ancient structures and cutting-edge technology. Massive orbital elevators stretched into space while primitive cities sprawled across continents, their inhabitants seemingly unbothered by the contradictions. The orbital facility where they docked was even more impressive up close. Species that had been enemies for centuries worked side by side, their conflicts apparently forgotten in pursuit of common goals. Zara watched in amazement as a group of hegemony engineers collaborated with former crystal-form slaves to design some kind of advanced propulsion system. "This is Unity Station," Morrison explained as they disembarked. "It's our attempt to prove that cooperation works better than the traditional galactic model of species-based segregation. We've got refugees, outcasts, political dissidents, and free thinkers from 300 different worlds." The human official who greeted them was a woman named Director Sarah Williams, whose title seemed to encompass everything from diplomatic affairs to military strategy. She was smaller than Morrison but radiated an intensity that suggested she was accustomed to making decisions that affected entire star systems. "Captain Morrison's rescue operation has caused quite a stir," Williams said without preamble. "The Aquarian government is demanding your immediate return, while the Galactic Council is threatening sanctions against Earth for interfering with sovereign justice proceedings. 3 other species have filed formal complaints about human violation of established legal protocols." "And our response?" Morrison asked. "We're going to put the entire galactic justice system on trial," Williams replied with a smile that was simultaneously warm and terrifying. "Ms. Velton's case is going to become the catalyst for something that's been building for decades, a complete restructuring of how justice works in our little corner of the universe." Zara felt overwhelmed by the implications. I'm just one person. Surely my case isn't significant enough to challenge institutions that have existed for millennia. You're wrong about that, William said, leading them through corridors filled with bustling activity. Your case represents everything that's broken about the current system. A respected scientist condemned based on political considerations rather than evidence, sentenced to a death so horrible that no one has ever survived it, and abandoned by a legal framework that prioritizes order over justice. They entered a vast conference chamber where dozens of beings from across the galaxy were engaged in heated discussions. Zara recognized representatives from major species, but also saw many individuals she couldn't identify, beings who bore the marks of persecution, exile, or rebellion against their home governments. Welcome to the first session of what we're calling the Alternative Justice Assembly, Williams announced. Every being in this room has been failed by the traditional galactic legal system in some way. They're here to design something better. The assembly was unlike any governmental body Zara had ever seen. Rather than the formal hierarchies and procedural restrictions of the Galactic Council, this group operated through dynamic discussion and consensus building. Ideas were evaluated based on merit, rather than the political status of their proponents. Dr. Thanes, a former Aquarian legal scholar who had been exiled for criticizing her government's treatment of dissidents, presented Zara's case to the assembly. The evidence was displayed in three-dimensional holographic form, allowing everyone to examine the technical details of the accident that had led to her conviction. The contamination of the sacred waters was clearly the result of catastrophic system failure, Dr. Thanes explained. The ship's emergency logs show that Captain Velton made every possible effort to prevent environmental damage. Her conviction was based entirely on political necessity rather than criminal culpability. A Zephyrian former prosecutor named Kevix raised a challenging question. Even if we accept that this case represents a miscarriage of justice, what authority do we have to challenge decisions made by sovereign governments? The Aquarian legal system may be flawed, but it operates under principles that have been recognized by the Galactic Council for centuries. That's exactly the problem, responded Marcus Chen, a human legal theorist whose work had influenced the development of Earth's diplomatic strategy. The current system grants absolute authority to individual species governments, with no mechanism for challenging decisions that violate fundamental principles of justice. We're not questioning Aquarian sovereignty. We're questioning whether any government should have the power to condemn individuals without meaningful evidence. The debate that followed was intense, but illuminating. Zara listened as beings from dozens of different legal traditions shared examples of how the current system had failed them. Political prisoners condemned for thought crimes, scientists exiled for research that challenged official orthodoxy, soldiers punished for refusing to commit atrocities. The pattern was consistent across species and cultures. What we're proposing, Williams said during a break in the proceedings, is not revolution but evolution. A parallel justice system that offers refuge and advocacy for beings whose own governments have abandoned them. Species that participate would agree to certain baseline standards for evidence, due process, and proportionality in sentencing. And those that refuse to participate? Zara asked. Face economic and diplomatic isolation from an increasingly powerful alliance of progressive worlds, Morrison replied. Humans aren't the only species that's grown tired of the status quo. We've just been the most vocal about it. Over the following days, Zara watched the assembly develop the framework for what they called the Interspecies Justice Compact. The document was revolutionary in its scope, establishing universal standards for criminal proceedings, creating mechanisms for appeal and review, and most importantly, declaring that certain punishments, including exile to death worlds like Terminus 7, were crimes against sapient life regardless of the legal authority that imposed them. The human approach to diplomacy became clear as delegations from various progressive worlds arrived to review the compact. Rather than seeking approval from existing power structures, Earth was building a new coalition of species that shared similar values. The traditional galactic powers would be forced to either adapt or find themselves increasingly isolated. The Aquarian government has agreed to negotiations, Williams announced during one of the assembly sessions. They're claiming it's about resolving the diplomatic incident, but intelligence sources suggest They're more concerned about losing access to human technology and trade partnerships. The negotiations would take place on neutral ground, a space station in the Centauri system that had been specifically constructed for interspecies mediation. The human delegation would include legal experts, diplomats, and most importantly, Zara herself as living proof that the traditional system had failed. "Are you prepared for this?" Morrison asked her as they prepared to depart Earth. "The Aquarian negotiators are going to do everything they can to discredit you personally. They'll claim you're a traitor who abandoned her own species for human protection." Zara considered the question carefully. A few weeks ago, she had been a respected scientist facing an unjust execution. Now she was at the center of a diplomatic revolution that could reshape galactic civilization. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to prevent others from suffering as she had. "I'm ready," she said finally. "If my case can help create a system where evidence matters more than politics, where no being faces death for the convenience of their government, then everything we've been through will have been worthwhile." The journey to Centauri Station took place under heavy escort. The human fleet that accompanied them was smaller than what the major powers could deploy, but their ships incorporated technology that made conventional tactical analysis difficult. Adaptive armor, quantum encrypted communications, and weapon systems based on principles that most species didn't fully understand. "One last thing," Williams said as they approached the station. "The negotiations are just the beginning. Win or lose, we're committed to building the alternative system. The question is whether the traditional powers will join us in creating something better, or whether they'll force us to build it in opposition to them." Through the viewport, Centauri Station gleamed in the light of twin suns, its neutral architecture representing the hope for peaceful resolution. But Zara knew that the beings gathering there carried the weight of centuries of injustice, and the decisions made in the coming days would determine whether the galaxy moved toward a more just future or fractured into competing systems of law and order. The interior of the human ship was a revelation that challenged everything Zara thought she knew about their species. While other galactic vessels prioritized elegant curves and organic aesthetics, the Defiance was built like a fortress. Every surface was reinforced, every system had multiple backups, and the very air seemed to hum with the power of over-engineered machinery. "Welcome aboard humanity's first deep hazmat rescue vessel," Morrison said as they passed through multiple decontamination chambers. Each stage subjected them to different cleansing processes: chemical neutralizers, radiation scrubbers, biological sterilizers, and several others that Zara couldn't identify. "We built her specifically for operations that other species consider impossible." The crew she encountered was as surprising as the ship itself. While most galactic vessels were staffed by single species, the Defiance's complement included not just humans, but also representatives from a dozen different worlds. What united them wasn't biology but philosophy. They were all beings who had been marginalized by the existing galactic order. "That's Lieutenant Corva." Morrison indicated a Zephyrian whose feathered crest bore scars from acid burns. Her government branded her a traitor for questioning their military's use of banned weapons. "The tall one over there is Engineer Thex, a crystal form who was exiled for developing technology his people considered too dangerous to exist." Zara realized she was looking at a crew of outcasts and rebels, beings who had found purpose aboard a ship commanded by the galaxy's newest and most unpredictable species. It explained how they had managed to achieve the impossible rescue. They were all experts at operating outside normal parameters. Dr. Sarah Chen, the ship's chief medical officer, ran a series of scans to ensure Zara hadn't suffered any contamination from her brief exposure to Terminus 7's atmosphere. The human physician worked with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous, her equipment automatically adapting to alien physiology in ways that suggested years of experience treating non-human patients. "You're lucky Captain Morrison reached you when he did," Chen reported. "Another 10 minutes and the pod's life support would have been compromised beyond recovery. Your people's environmental suits are impressive, but they're not designed for the kind of aggressive chemical assault that Terminus 7 represents." "How is any of this possible?" Zara asked. "No species has ever successfully operated in that environment. The acidic compounds should have dissolved your ship within minutes." Morrison settled into a chair beside her medical bed, his expression growing serious. "Because we approached the problem differently. Most galactic species see Terminus 7 as an environment hostile to life, so they designed systems that avoid exposure. We saw it as an engineering challenge to be solved through superior material science and redundant safety systems. But the cost, Zara protested. The resources required to develop such technology just to rescue one condemned prisoner. It makes no economic sense. That's where you're wrong, Morrison replied. You're not just one prisoner. You're proof that the galactic justice system is fundamentally flawed. Your case has been followed very closely by human intelligence services, and we've identified dozens of similar situations where politics trumped facts in determining guilt. The ship's navigator, a hegemony refugee named Vex, approached with a data tablet displaying their current position. Captain, we've cleared Terminus 7's gravity well and are preparing for the jump to hyperspace. However, we're detecting multiple ships moving to intercept us. It appears the Aquarian government has decided to prevent our departure. Morrison studied the tactical display with the calm focus of someone accustomed to impossible situations. 6 Aquarian patrol vessels were moving to surround them, while 2 heavy cruisers approached from the outer system. It was a formidable force, more than enough to destroy a single human ship. They can't legally fire on us, Morrison mused. We're operating under diplomatic immunity, and technically we rescued a condemned prisoner from a lethal environment, which could be argued as a humanitarian action. Legal technicalities won't protect us if they decide to claim we're pirates or terrorists, Corva observed. The Aquarian military has a reputation for shooting first and justifying it later. Zara felt a crushing weight of guilt settle over her. These beings had risked everything to save her life, and now they were facing destruction because of her situation. The human captain seemed to read her thoughts. Don't even think about offering to surrender yourself, Morrison said firmly. We knew the risks when we came here. Besides, running from superior forces is another area where human engineering philosophy differs from galactic norms. The ship shuddered as it engaged some kind of advanced stealth system. The bridge lights dimmed and multiple displays showed the vessel's energy signature rapidly diminishing. Within moments, they had effectively vanished from conventional sensors. Adaptive camouflage combined with sensor scattering fields, Engineer Thex explained, his crystalline form glowing with professional pride. It's a technique developed by human military researchers who studied natural camouflage systems. Rather than simply hiding, the ship actively mimics the background radiation patterns of empty space. The Aquarian ships continued their search pattern, but their scans passed harmlessly through the Defiance's position without detecting anything. It was like watching predators hunt for prey that had become functionally invisible. The stealth won't last long, Morrison warned. Eventually, they'll expand their search grid enough to detect our thermal signature. We need to reach the hyperspace jump point before that happens. The next 20 minutes were among the most tense Zara had ever experienced. The ship moved through the Aquarian blockade like a ghost, occasionally adjusting course to avoid the searching vessels while maintaining minimal engine output. Several times they passed close enough to enemy ships that Zara could see their hull markings on the tactical display. When they finally reached the jump coordinates, Morrison didn't hesitate. The hyperdrive engaged with a rumble that seemed to shake the ship down to its molecular structure, and the stars outside shifted into the familiar streaks of faster-than-light travel. Destination? Vex inquired. Earth, Morrison replied. It's time the galaxy met some of our more persuasive diplomats. During the journey, Zara learned more about the human approach to galactic politics. Unlike other species who sought to fit into existing power structures, humans had decided to create their own diplomatic framework based on principles that often conflicted with established norms. Most galactic civilizations achieved interstellar travel through gradual technological development over millennia, Dr. Chen explained during one of their conversations. They had time to establish stable social structures and legal systems before expanding beyond their home worlds. Humans went from barely understanding nuclear physics to faster-than-light travel in less than a century. We skipped a lot of the social evolution that other species went through, Morrison added. We're still basically the same aggressive, stubborn, problem-solving primates we were when we were throwing rocks at each other. The only difference is that now we throw rocks at interstellar distances. The ship carried an extensive database of legal precedents from across the galaxy, and Zara spent much of the journey reviewing cases similar to her own. What she found was disturbing, a pattern of political prosecutions disguised as criminal justice. with inconvenient individuals being disposed of through legal mechanisms that prioritize convenience over truth. Your case isn't unique, Morrison told her during one of these research sessions. It's just the most blatant example we've encountered. A respected scientist condemned to death because her accident embarrassed the wrong people, with evidence that clearly suggested mechanical failure rather than criminal negligence. But how can you challenge centuries of established legal tradition? Zara asked. The Galactic Council's justice protocols have been in place since before your species discovered fire. Morrison's smile was predatory. That's the advantage of being newcomers. We're not bound by the same assumptions about what's possible or acceptable. When we see a system that's broken, we don't try to reform it gradually over generations. We build a better alternative and prove it works. As they approached Earth's solar system, Zara got her first glimpse of what that alternative might look like. The human homeworld was surrounded by a network of space stations and orbital facilities that dwarfed anything she had seen elsewhere in the galaxy. More impressive than their scale was their diversity. Clearly these installations had been built by multiple species working in cooperation. Welcome to the real reason the Galactic Council is nervous about humanity, Morrison said as Earth filled the view screen. We're not just another member species trying to find our place in the existing order. We're building something entirely new. The pod hit the surface of Terminus 7 with a sickening splash, immediately beginning to sink into the viscous chemical soup that passed for ground. Zara's environmental suit alarms were already screaming warnings about atmospheric contamination and rising external temperature. Through the pod's rapidly clouding viewport, she could see bubbles of toxic gas rising through the sludge like some nightmarish hot springs. She had perhaps 30 minutes before the pod's hull would be compromised enough to let the deadly atmosphere inside. The emergency beacon attached to her suit was broadcasting on all frequencies, though she knew no rescue would come. The beacon was merely a legal requirement, a token gesture to maintain the illusion that condemned prisoners had some hope of salvation. Forcing herself to think clearly despite the terror clawing at her mind, Zara activated the pod's emergency systems and attempted to scan for any elevated terrain. The readings were grim. The entire visible area was covered in the same toxic sludge, varying only in depth and chemical composition. Some pools registered temperatures hot enough to boil water. Others showed acidity levels that could dissolve starship hulls. The pod's external camera feed showed movement in the sludge around her. At first she thought it might be some form of life, but the computer quickly identified the shapes as chunks of dissolving debris, the remains of previous waste drops, cargo containers, and perhaps other condemned prisoners who had preceded her to this hell. Her communications array crackled with static, the interference caused by the constant electrical storms in the upper atmosphere. But through the noise, she caught fragments of something that made her heart race. Transmissions on frequencies used by the human diplomatic Corps, 7th hour of approach, atmospheric entry in 30 minutes, navigational, hazards confirmed. It couldn't be possible. No species in their right mind would attempt a rescue mission to Terminus 7. The logistical challenges alone were staggering. Any ship that lingered in the system risked contamination, and landing on the surface was considered tantamount to suicide. Yet as her pod continued to sink and the hull began to show signs of stress, Zara saw something that defied all logic. A shape was descending through the toxic clouds above, moving with purpose and control rather than the chaotic tumbling of falling debris. The object was sleek and angular, its design unlike anything in the standard galactic fleet databases. The craft touched down on a relatively solid section of waste about 200 meters from her position. Steam rose where its landing struts made contact with the acidic surface, but the ship appeared to be holding together against the hostile environment. Most remarkably, it was maintaining structural integrity in conditions that should have dissolved it within minutes. Zara's suit radio burst to life with a transmission on the emergency frequency. Zara Veltan, this is Captain James Morrison of the Earth vessel Defiance. I'm here to get you out of this mess, but we need to move fast. My ship's coating can protect us for maybe an hour in this suit before it starts to break down. Human, she gasped, hardly believing what she was hearing. You came to Terminus 7? That's impossible. No one survives here. Yeah, well, nobody told us it was impossible until after we'd already figured out how to do it. Morrison's voice carried a dry humor that seemed absurdly out of place given their circumstances. Our engineers are good at solving problems other species consider unsolvable. Now, can you get out of that pod before it becomes your coffin? Zara looked at her environmental suit's readouts. The suit was rated for hostile environments, but nothing like this. The moment she stepped outside, she would be exposed to atmospheric conditions that could kill her in multiple different ways simultaneously. My suit won't last 5 minutes out there, she replied. Even if I could reach your ship, the exposure would kill me before I made it halfway. That's what these are for, Morrison said. Through her pod's deteriorating viewport, she could see a figure in an unusual environmental suit emerging from the human ship. The suit was bulkier than standard galactic designs with additional layers and what appeared to be active cooling systems. The figure was carrying a second suit of similar design. The human moved across the treacherous surface with surprising agility, using some kind of hovering platform that kept him above the worst of the acidic sludge. The platform's repulsors seemed to be specially shielded against the corrosive environment, another impossible technological solution. Human engineering philosophy is different from what you're used to, Morrison explained as he approached her pod. Most galactic species design equipment to operate in optimal conditions. When those conditions change, the equipment fails gracefully and safely. We design our stuff to keep working even when everything goes wrong. The pod shuddered as another section of its hull began to fail. Acidic vapors were starting to seep through the emergency seals, triggering more alarms on Zara's suit. She had minutes at most before the environment inside the pod became lethal. Morrison reached her position and began attaching some kind of external interface to the pod's emergency airlock. The suit I brought you is designed for extreme hazmat operations. It's probably overkill for most galactic standards, but then again, most galactic species never had to deal with the aftermath of industrial accidents on Earth. We've had a lot of practice dealing with places where everything is trying to kill you. Why are you doing this? Zara asked as the airlock cycled and Morrison passed the suit through the transfer chamber. Your people barely have diplomatic status. Interfering with a legal execution could destroy your standing with the Galactic Council. Let's just say humans have strong opinions about justice systems that are more interested in politics than facts, Morrison replied. Plus, your research on interspecies cooperation caught the attention of some people back on Earth. We think you might be worth the diplomatic incident this is going to cause. The suit Morrison had brought was indeed unlike anything Zara had ever seen. It had multiple redundant life support systems, active chemical neutralization fields, and armor plating that looked like it could withstand a direct hit from ship's weapons. Getting into it within the confines of the deteriorating pod was a challenge, but the alternative was certain death. Fair warning, Morrison said as Zara sealed the helmet. The ride back to my ship is going to be rough. This platform wasn't designed for 2 people, and the atmospheric conditions are getting worse. We're going to have to move fast and hope my ship's defenses hold out long enough to get us off this rock. The moment they left the pod, Zara understood why the human had seemed so confident. The specialized suit didn't just protect her from the hostile environment, it actively adapted to counter-specific threats. When acidic vapor tried to eat through the seals, the suit's systems automatically deployed chemical neutralizers. When the temperature spiked from a nearby geyser of superheated sludge, cooling systems kicked in to maintain safe internal conditions. The hover platform bucked and swayed as they crossed the intervening distance, Morrison fighting to keep them stable in the face of unpredictable thermal updrafts and corrosive wind shears. Twice they had to detour around pools of particularly aggressive chemical compounds that the platform's sensors flagged as immediate threats. The thing about humans, Morrison said through gritted teeth as he wrestled with the platform's controls, is that we're really good at refusing to accept that something can't be done. When the Galactic Council said Terminus 7 was a death sentence with no possibility of survival, our response was to figure out how to survive there anyway. The human ship loomed ahead of them, its hull bearing scorch marks from the acidic atmosphere, but still maintaining structural integrity. The airlock was already cycling open, ready to receive them. Of course, Morrison added as they approached safety. The really hard part isn't getting you off this moon. The really hard part is going to be convincing the galaxy that the justice system that sent you here needs to change. Zara's webbed fingers trembled as the metal restraints bit into her scaled wrists. The courtroom stretched before her like a vast cathedral of judgment. its crystalline walls pulsing with the soft blue light that her people found comforting. Today, that light felt cold and merciless. The High Magistrate of Kepler 442b loomed above her on his elevated platform, his forearms gesturing dramatically as he read from the digital scroll that would seal her fate. His voice echoed through the chamber with the weight of absolute authority. Zara Veltan, daughter of the noble house of Vel, you stand convicted of the most heinous crime known to our civilization. You have willfully contaminated the sacred waters of Nethara with alien substances, endangering not only our current generation, but countless generations yet to come. The words hit her like physical blows. Around the courtroom, hundreds of her fellow Aquarians sat in absolute silence, their large eyes fixed upon her with a mixture of horror and disgust. These were beings she had grown up with, played with as a child, studied alongside in the great universities of their underwater cities. Now they looked at her as if she were some diseased creature dragged up from the deepest trenches. Zara wanted to scream that it had been an accident. The research vessel she commanded had been studying unusual mineral deposits in the asteroid belt when a catastrophic hull breach occurred. Emergency protocols demanded immediate return to base, but she knew the ship was leaking unknown compounds. She had tried to jettison the contaminated materials, but the ship's systems failed. When they crash-landed in the sacred waters, the damage was already done, but the court had already decided her guilt. The evidence was circumstantial, the testimony of her crew dismissed as attempts to protect their captain. The noble houses wanted a scapegoat for the disaster, and Zara, despite her family's status, was the perfect choice. Her progressive views on interspecies cooperation had already made her enemies among the traditionalists. The sentence, the High Magistrate continued, his voice growing even more grave, is exiled to the death sludge of Terminus 7. There you will remain until your body dissolves into the acidic waste, a fitting end for one who has poisoned our most sacred places. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Even Zara's harshest critics hadn't expected such a severe punishment. The death sludge was a place of legend and nightmare, a moon-sized dumping ground where the galaxy's most toxic industrial waste was stored. Nothing could survive there for more than a few hours. The acidic atmosphere would eat through even the most advanced environmental suits. Zara's mother, seated in the family section, let out a wail of anguish that pierced the formal silence. Her father sat rigid, his face a mask of controlled fury. They had spent their family's entire fortune trying to hire the best lawyers, calling in every political favor. But the tide of public opinion had been too strong. As the guards moved to escort her away, Zara caught sight of a figure in the observer gallery that made her pause. A human sat among the diplomatic corps, his pale skin and small eyes marking him as one of the newcomers to galactic society. Most species still viewed humans with suspicion. They were primitives who had only achieved faster-than-light travel a few decades ago, yet they had somehow managed to secure minor diplomatic status through a combination of tenacity and stubborn refusal to be ignored. The human was watching her with an intensity that seemed out of place. While others in the gallery showed various emotions, satisfaction, horror, political calculation, his expression was one of careful analysis, as if he were solving a complex puzzle. When their eyes met briefly, he gave an almost imperceptible nod. The transport ship that would carry her to Terminus 7 was a converted cargo hauler, its hull scarred from years of carrying the galaxy's refuse to its final destination. The crew treated her with professional detachment, neither cruel nor kind. She was simply cargo to be delivered. Her cell was a small cube with basic life support and a single porthole. As the ship engaged its hyperdrive and the stars stretched into lines, Zara pressed her face to the thick transparasteel and watched her homeworld disappear. The blue-green sphere that had been her entire universe grew smaller and smaller, until it was just another point of light, then vanished entirely. During the journey, she learned more about her destination. Terminus 7 had been chosen as the galaxy's waste dump because it orbited a dying star in an otherwise empty system. The moon's surface was covered in vast pools of industrial sludge, chemical waste from 1,000 different worlds. The atmosphere was a toxic soup that could dissolve most forms of matter within hours. The few prisoners who had been sent there over the centuries had left behind only audio logs that cut off abruptly as their equipment failed. Their final transmissions spoke of burning pain as the acidic air ate through their protective gear. of watching their own flesh dissolve as they desperately searched for any shelter that didn't exist. On the third day of travel, one of the guards brought news that surprised even the jaded crew. "There's been some kind of diplomatic incident," he told his partner within earshot of Zara's cell. "That human ambassador has been making a fuss at the Galactic Council, demanding access to prisoner transport records, claiming some kind of jurisdiction." "Humans," the other guard scoffed. "They think because they stumbled onto FTL technology, they can challenge decisions that have stood for millennia. What do they even know about justice?" But Zara remembered the intensity in the human's eyes during her sentencing. There had been something there, a calculation or plan that she couldn't understand. Humans were known for their unpredictability, their tendency to approach problems from angles that other species would never consider. As the ship dropped out of hyperspace and Terminus 7 filled the view screen, Zara felt a deep despair settle over her. The moon was exactly as horrible as she had imagined, a mottled brown and green sphere covered in swirling clouds of toxic gas. Lightning flickered constantly through the atmosphere, electrical discharges caused by the interaction of countless chemical compounds. The crew wasted no time. Within an hour of arrival, they had fitted her with a basic environmental suit designed to last just long enough for the ship to escape the system. The suit's computer cheerfully informed her that she had approximately 6 hours of life support, though the acidic atmosphere would likely breach the seals long before that. Standing at the airlock, looking down at the hellish landscape below, Zara closed her eyes and tried to remember the feeling of clean water flowing over her gills. In a few minutes, she would be alone on the most hostile world in known space, with no hope of rescue and no possibility of survival. The airlock cycled, and she was pushed into the transport pod that would carry her to the surface. As the pod detached from the ship and began its descent, she watched through the small window as her captors fled the system as quickly as possible. Nobody wanted to linger near Terminus 7. 2 years after her rescue from Terminus 7, Zara stood before the largest gathering of interspecies representatives in galactic history. The Great Assembly Hall on Unity Station had been expanded 3 times to accommodate delegations from over 200 worlds, all gathered to witness the formal ratification of the Universal Justice Charter. The charter represented the culmination of everything that had begun with her case. What started as a human rescue mission had evolved into a complete transformation of how civilized species approached law, justice, and individual rights. The principles that had once been radical human concepts were now accepted as fundamental truths by the majority of galactic civilization. The Universal Justice Charter, announced Secretary General Martinez, the first human to hold such a position in galactic governance, establishes for the first time in our history a common standard of justice that transcends species, culture, and political systems. It declares that certain rights belong to all sapient beings, regardless of their origin or the government under which they live. The ceremony was broadcast to every inhabited world in known space, watched by trillions of beings whose lives would be affected by the principles being enshrined into galactic law. The rights enumerated in the charter were simple but revolutionary. The right to evidence-based legal proceedings, the right to proportional punishment, the right to appeal unjust convictions, and most importantly, the right to protection from any government that violated these basic standards. Zara's role in the ceremony was largely symbolic, but deeply meaningful. As the first person rescued under what was now called the Morrison Doctrine, the principle that humanitarian intervention was justified when governments condemned their own citizens without proper evidence, she had become a living symbol of the new order. Director Velton, Secretary General Martinez called, "Please approach the podium." Walking across the stage felt surreal. The chamber contained beings she had once considered enemies, Aquarian officials who had condemned her, hegemony representatives who had initially opposed the charter, crystal-formed diplomats who had argued for maintaining traditional power structures. Now they all stood in applause as she took her place at the center of galactic attention. 2 years ago, Zara began, her voice carrying clearly through the universal translation systems, I was a condemned prisoner facing death for a crime I did not commit. Today I stand before you as proof that justice delayed is not justice denied, if we have the courage to fight for what is right. She paused, looking out at the assembled representatives. In the front row sat the beings who had made this moment possible. Morrison, now Admiral of the Combined Progressive Fleet. Director Williams, whose diplomatic strategies had reshaped galactic politics. Dr. Chen, whose medical expertise had helped establish standards for humane treatment of prisoners. The charter we ratify today is not an end, but a beginning. It establishes principles that we must vigilantly protect and expand. Every species represented here has contributed to its development, bringing their own wisdom and experience to create something greater than any of us could have achieved alone. The human approach to coalition building had proven remarkably effective. Rather than imposing their own values on other species, they had created a framework where every culture could contribute their understanding of justice while adhering to universal standards. The result was a document that reflected the best philosophical traditions of 200 different civilizations. But principles without enforcement are merely words, Zara continued. The true test of our commitment will come when we face the difficult cases, the politically inconvenient truths, the moments when doing what is right conflicts with what is expedient. The Galactic Justice Tribunal, established under the Charter, would have enforcement powers that exceeded anything previously seen in interspecies governance. Member species agreed to submit to external review of their legal systems, accept intervention in cases of egregious injustice, and face economic sanctions for persistent violations of Charter principles. The transformation hadn't been without cost. Several major species had refused to sign the Charter, creating a parallel block of traditionalist governments. Trade between the two systems was minimal, and there were ongoing tensions about resource rights and territorial boundaries. But the Progressive Alliance controlled the majority of advanced manufacturing and research, giving them significant advantages in any prolonged competition. The Charter also establishes our commitment to redemption, rather than mere punishment, Zara said. Moving to one of the most innovative aspects of the new system, we reject the premise that any being is beyond rehabilitation, that any crime justifies abandonment of our shared humanity. The rehabilitation protocols developed under human guidance had achieved remarkable success rates. Even prisoners who had committed serious violent crimes showed significant improvement when treated with dignity and offered genuine opportunities for personal growth. The old model of purely punitive justice was giving way to systems focused on healing both victims and perpetrators. As Zara concluded her remarks, the formal voting began. Species after species cast their approval for the Charter, each vote representing millions or billions of beings who would live under its protection. The final tally was overwhelming: 187 votes in favor, 12 abstentions, and only 3 opposition votes from species that had announced their intention to withdraw from Charter jurisdiction. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Beings from dozens of worlds participated in cultural exchanges, sharing art, music, and literature that reflected their diverse perspectives on justice and freedom. Human jazz musicians performed alongside Zephyrian wind orchestras, while crystal-form light sculptors collaborated with Aquarian water dancers to create displays of impossible beauty. During the festivities, Zara found herself in a quiet conversation with High Magistrate Velcorin, the same official who had originally condemned her to death. The Aquarian's presence at the celebration was itself a symbol of how much had changed. "I owe you an apology," Velcorin said, his translator rendering his words with unusual formality. "My judgment in your case was influenced by political pressures that should never have entered a court of law. The evidence clearly supported your innocence, but I allowed other considerations to override my duty to truth." "Your apology is appreciated," Zara replied, "but the real question is whether we can prevent similar failures in the future. The Charter provides the framework, but implementation will require constant vigilance. The Aquarian legal system has been completely restructured according to Charter standards," Velcorin assured her. "We've established independent review boards, evidence standards that prioritize scientific analysis over political convenience, and appeal processes that include external oversight. It's been difficult for traditionalists to accept, but the results speak for themselves." The conversation was interrupted by Admiral Morrison, who approached with news that would shape the next phase of galactic development. "We've received a communication from the Outer Rim territories," he announced. 3 previously uncontacted species have requested membership in the Charter system. They've been monitoring our broadcasts and want to join the Progressive Alliance. It was exactly what human strategists had hoped, for the charter system was becoming so attractive that even species with no prior contact were seeking membership. The combination of economic benefits, technological sharing, and protection from injustice was proving irresistible to civilizations across the galaxy. There's more, Morrison continued. Intelligence reports suggest that several traditionalist species are experiencing internal pressure to join the Charter. Their populations are seeing the prosperity and freedom enjoyed by Charter members and demanding similar reforms. The transformation was accelerating beyond anyone's projections. What had begun as a rescue mission to save one condemned prisoner had become a revolution in galactic governance that was spreading to the farthest reaches of known space. As the celebration continued into the night, Zara stood once again on Unity Station's observation deck, watching the lights of countless ships carrying the news of the Charter's ratification to every corner of the galaxy. In a few hours, beings on thousands of worlds would wake to find themselves protected by universal standards of justice that their governments could no longer ignore. The young Aquarian scientist who had faced death on Terminus 7 was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that the arc of justice might be long, but it could be bent through the combined efforts of beings who refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, implementing the Charter's provisions, dealing with traditionalist resistance, expanding protection to species not yet reached by progressive influence. But tonight was for celebration, for recognizing how far they had all come, and for acknowledging that the universe was a more just place than it had been when the human ship Defiance first descended through the toxic clouds of a moon that was supposed to be a place of death. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility and the promise that no being would ever again face the horrors she had survived, simply for the crime of inconveniencing those I